So there's only really two things I want to talk about here. The story of Ocarina of Time and the gameplay. There's thousands of videos out there on Ocarina of Time that go in depth about everything, but this won't be one of those. My goal is to try and highlight what I believe to be one of the biggest strengths of Ocarina of Time and one of the biggest weaknesses. And because I believe on leaving things on a high note, let's talk about the biggest weakness first. The biggest weakness of Ocarina of Time is the enemy design. By that I mean how most enemies, particularly bosses, move and attack. Their art design is fantastic. When it comes to the question, what makes a good game, those of you who have been following me for a while now know that I like the idea that a good game produces meaningful play. Meaningful play, according to the rules of play by Salen and Zimmerman, is play that requires that at some level a player has an active and engaged relationship to the game and is making choices with meaningful outcomes. A player that does nothing but await and hope and trembling the cast of the die cannot be engaged in meaningful play. I'll take this definition further and add that a byproduct of meaningful play and meaningful engagement is the player experiencing a state of flow, but that is a topic for another time. It is the word await that I want to hone in on here. When it comes to the idea of meaningful choices a player makes, this doesn't just mean the game gives a decision tree or a morality system. On a macro level, it can. What it means is that the player makes decisions on the smallest level, and those decisions have a result that is directly related to players' actions. If I lock onto an enemy and hit A, I do a jump attack resulting in a dead Dagobaba. On a slightly higher level, it means that I can choose to engage Dagobaba in any way that I want to, or not at all. So what does this have to do with boss design? Let's look at one of the first enemies you encounter in the first dungeon, the Skulltula. Your first encounter with the Skulltula likely resulted in you getting hurt. You then try to attack, which results in your sword simply bouncing off of it. You then learn that you must wait for this enemy to expose its belly before you attack. Let's look at another enemy, the Wolfos. This enemy circles you, and when you attempt to attack it, it blocks most of your attacks. The only way to hit this enemy is to wait for it to attack and then counter with an attack of your own. The boss of the second dungeon also requires that you wait until he inhales so that you can throw a bomb in his mouth. Are you seeing the pattern here? Most of the bosses, and a few particularly egregious examples from the basic enemies, follow this pattern. You must wait and then attack in a very specific way. So why is this a problem? As we'll get into later, boss battles function not just as the climax of gameplay, but a climax of that particular story arc. They are important encounters that stick out in the player's mind. Therefore, a design flaw in that encounter could tarnish an otherwise perfect gameplay experience. The fact that you must wait removes an element of choice in the battle. You must wait and then attack in a specific way. It removes choice in how you attack and takes the pace of the battle away from you, the player, and gives it to the boss. In short, it can make the fight feel really boring and one-dimensional. This is not to say that any boss that operates in this way in video games has poor design. It is possible to have a boss control the pace of the fight, and the fight still appears to engage the player in a meaningful way. The trick is to design the fight in a way so that if the player must wait, they don't notice it. There must be other distractions in the fight. Other enemies to pay attention to, or a fast boss attack cycle will keep the player on their toes so they don't notice they are waiting for an opening. Sadly, Ocarina of Time never does this from a boss mechanic perspective. It is clear, though, that Nintendo did actually mask this flaw by having bosses, music, and settings with incredible art design, so that many players actually don't notice this waiting design flaw, or they choose to overlook it when they reflect on the game. To contrast the wait design with a properly designed enemy, recall the Iron Knuckle, or the final boss Ganon. When you fight these enemies, you are free to move and strike the way you want, and how frequently you want to. You could spam the attack button, and most likely die in the process, or carefully bait and position the enemy the way you want to before you strike. The choice is yours, and victory or defeat feels entirely up to the choices you make in the fight. This waiting issue is arguably Ocarina of Time's greatest flaw. And it's a shame, really. Everything about the game feels epic, even the boss fights. Imagine how much more epic and engaging the game would be if the combat system were perfected in the enemy design. It's not a fatal flaw, and it's not a problem with every enemy, but it is the one blemish on an otherwise perfect game. Speaking of perfect, when it comes to the parts of OOT that make up a great game, story structure is a big component. Obviously, the most important and paramount task of a game developer should be your core mechanics, but having a great story can change a great game into an iconic one. I've always loved the story of Ocarina of Time, but since revisiting the game as an adult, I've been trying to figure out why, something I'm trying to do with all the games I'm revisiting. With OOT, I think I figured it out. Ironically, it also has to do with pacing, but in a storytelling sense. Pacing in a story is how it ebbs and flows. Typically, when we think of a structure of a story, most authors will discuss the three-act structure. However, recently as I've been studying storytelling, I've come to see that the mini-arc structure is a better way to view stories, and it is at play in Ocarina of Time. All stories have an arc. Stakes start low, slowly building towards the climax at the end of the film, movie, or game. A problem can occur if the tension builds all the way through with no breaks. The audience never gets a moment to breathe or relax, and many get bored or desensitized to the stress. While some viewers or players may like that, many don't, on a subconscious level. I know I'm asserting that. I have no studies to back this up yet. In order to fix this, it's best to think of a story as many smaller arcs with their own rising tension and climaxes connected by the phrase, "and then," so that each smaller arc flows into the other. Video games have been using this structure since the beginning. The generic formula of stage design has each level typically get harder towards the end, concluding with a boss fight as the climax, and then flowing into the next level. Despite not having hardline stages, Ocarina of Time follows this structure while also including side characters whose arcs progress along with the mini-arcs. Arc 1 begins in the Kokiri Forest with the meeting of Saria, whose arc starts here, with the climax being the fight with Goma, death of the Jakku tree, and saying goodbye to Saria. And then Link learns he must meet Princess Zelda. Arc 2 has Link travel to Hyrule Castle, climaxing with Link meeting Zelda. Zelda and Impan's arc starts here. And then he learns he needs to go to Kakariko Village and Death Mountain. Arc 3 has Link meet Darunia, whose arc starts here, and climaxes with Link fighting his way through the forest meadow to reunite with Saria. Then Link must go back to Death Mountain. For Arc 4, that climaxes with the defeat of King Dodongo and the bond being formed between Darunia and Link. Do you see what I'm getting at? Every dungeon and temple is the climax of the gameplay and the story arc, which results in two satisfying payoffs at the same time. Tension releases from the dungeon, and then you get a satisfying conclusion to the mini-story arc. Saria, Zelda, Darunia, Ruto, and Nabooru all have their own arcs that get you to care about them as characters with their relationship to Link. Impa should have had more screen time, I think, but we can talk about that later. Even Ganondorf is more than some big bad guy. Yes, he has simple motivations and a rather simple arc, but we see enough of him in the right way and at the right time that establishes him as an intimidating villain. This kind of storytelling was not new in games at the release of OOT, but it was an improvement specifically to the 3D entries that was so well received that it's basically been the model for 3D Zeldas ever since, with the exception of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but that's a discussion for another time. I also realize that what I'm describing is basic storytelling, and Ocarina of Time has characters and arcs that are really far removed from something like Lord of the Rings. But most of us play this game in our childhoods, and the child mind does wonders when it comes to filling in the gaps of basic or foundational quality storytelling. Saria gets one scene before Link basically abandons her. An adult might look at that scene and say there needs to be more of a setup for that payoff, but for some reason, child me was really sad watching that scene despite the minimal being done to establish a friendship between Link and Saria. Maybe kids develop parasocial relationships much faster than adults. We'll have to look into that. My point is that with this foundational mini-arc storytelling structure in place, Ocarina of Time made such an impact on the gaming world that it became nothing short of iconic for an entire generation. And on that positive note, I welcome any other respectful criticisms or additional thoughts on why Ocarina of Time is such a beloved game, or why you think it doesn't deserve it. Thank you all for listening.